Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the short time I have, I want to make three simple points in support of the motion that focus on climate. The first is a simple one, and it's this. It is essential, I think, that this House formally declares an environment and climate emergency. Now, I listened to the Environment Secretary, and I don't believe he formally committed the government to doing so. But he did recognise the situation that we face is an emergency. And that is in contrast, I have to say, to what the Minister for Energy and Clean Growth said last week. And I quote what she said, because it struck me at the time. I don't see the point of saying anything, she said, unless we take action. I don't think she could be more wrong, Madam Deputy Speaker, because language matters. Of course, deeds must follow words, but the manner in which we define problems shapes, in turn, our conceptions not only of the range of possible solutions to them, but what is necessary. We have to, I think, stop talking about climate change as if it were some benign force and start talking about what we are really confronting, an ongoing and accelerating crisis from which no one will escape and that will have profound and potentially existential consequences for everything every one of us holds dear. And that is why, at least to my mind, a degree of alarmism is entirely justified, and arguably a reason why I think the Extinction Rebellion movement has struck a chord, as long as that fear acts as a clarion call to act rather than merely prevents a sense of hopelessness. Complacency remains the greatest barrier to the response that's required, and we must therefore do everything we can possibly to bring home to the public both the nature of the threat we face and to build consensus for the kind of disruptive change that will inevitably have to take place as we respond to it. The second point is that the unique situation we find ourselves in demands a far more vigorous response than the government have provided to date, and it demands that it begin now. There is no doubting that there is cause for pride in the UK's record when it comes to climate action, but it is also undeniably the case that the reductions achieved over recent years are largely the result of having picked the low-hanging fruit, that our annual rate of emissions reduction is slowing, and that we are not on track to meet our binding emissions targets. Where then is the commitment from the government to bold policies of the kind that would drive deep decarbonisation across the whole of our economy and get us back on track? Given everything we know, the fact that the Paris pledges will still amount to 2.7 degrees of warming, that we're not on track for those pledges, our collective response cannot simply be business as usual. So legislating for net zero emissions by 2050 should be the absolute minimum we are aiming for, and it should spur a far more ambitious policy agenda. The third and final point is this. In my view, the institutions of government, as they are currently organised, are simply not set up for the scale and pace of the transition that is required to avert catastrophic climate breakdown. The abolition of DEC 3 years ago was a serious mistake, but it was also emblematic of a more deep-seated failure on the part of the government to accord emissions reduction the status it requires. When I was a member of the DEC Select Committee, I remember repeatedly pressing the then Secretary of State on the inadequacies of the Clean Growth Interministerial Group, but at least at that time a body of that kind existed. It doesn't now. If the government were really serious about this crisis, their response would be driven relentlessly from the centre, with the institutional architecture put in place to coordinate and drive progress across all departments, and with emissions reduction woven throughout government policy, and it isn't. Madam Deputy Speaker, in all likelihood, we have probably already squandered the opportunity to avert an unprecedented degree of warming. But what we do in the coming 10, 15 years will determine whether or not we avert even more drastic change and the suffering that will surely define a world where emissions continue to rise unabated. That is why we must declare an environment and climate change emergency, act in a way that is commensurate to such an emergency, and reform the machinery of government so that we're able to drive forward that agenda. And that is why I will be wholeheartedly supporting the motion this evening.
Richard Benyon.
It's a great pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, and I agree with him that I think